recording. I'm here with Eugene. How you doing today, Eugene?
Fantastic, feeling good.
Awesome. Yeah, I was taking a look at some of your writing. Uh, we've both actually talked about um, race realism. You're a philosopher of science, so you have more credentials and being able to talk about human biology than I do, at the very least. Do you have I'm vaguely aware of the field of philosophy of science. When you study that field, is it common to specialize into philosophy of science of biology, of physics, or do people try to remain what is that not intersectional? There's an academic
Inter-
term, interdisciplinary.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of either. So usually people will have expertise in like, say, philosophy of physics, and sometimes even like narrower than that. But then there's sort of some more big picture issues that a lot of philosophers of science, at least dabble their toes in, right? And it's not that hard to kind of move back and forth a bit, right? But like one of the things about philosophy of science is that it does get into the nitty gritty of like the details of science a fair amount. So it's hard to be very educated about those in a lot of different topics, right? So like I'm pretty knowledgeable about biology, at least as it's relevant to the stuff that I did. And, I can, I know more than your average undergrad about the other stuff, but I don't have a very deep understanding of like philosophy of physics or that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in science and I'm interested in philosophy, and clearly, when when the ancients talk, or even Renaissance, you talk about natural philosophy. That just was what people called science. Science is a more modern term for an empirical investigation of reality. I think today we classify, philosophy is necessarily axiomatic, and I think that's kind of influenced by Schopenhauer, right? So there's this idea that the only thing you can know, and also Descartes, right? The only thing you can know is sort of the immediacy of the perception of your own body, your own mind, your own experience. And if we're talking about empiricism and something Lockean, then that is completely external to our own questions about perception. What does it mean to be a human? Well, that's not an empirical question. That's just like how you feel or how you perceive yourself. It's sort of in the self-referential domain of consciousness. Whereas empiricism, it's this measuring, it's the act of quantifying, rationalizing. And I think even before we had modern computational science, I think you look at a guy like John Locke, and I feel like I'm reading um, a kind of precursor to computational science. That he's saying, okay, if you want to conceptualize a system, if you want to model a system, you have to use all of these different variables, and all of these variables are reducible to quantities. All these qualia have a spectrum of quantity within them, and that's exactly the kind of framework that you need if you're going to engage in computational science or algorithms of any sort. So there's this separation that empiricism relies, empiricism is something that a robot could do, or a golem, or an abacus or something. And as people are developing these machines, counting machines, the clock, actually, we don't often think about the clock as part of the Industrial Revolution, because it far preceded the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about like 14th century, way before the steam engine or anything like that. And yet, the clock and the gears, the mechanical gears that go into that, there is a kind of computation. There are ratios that you have to understand. So like that sort of empiricism, I think, with the invention of the clock, and maybe even earlier with nominalist philosophy, there is this branching where we clearly distinguish between empirical, external, quantitative science, and then philosophy as this kind of, maybe it's loosey-goosey, maybe it's more analytical, but at the end of the day, it is metaphysical. It's not dealing with observable quantities. It's dealing with qualia in itself somehow, in its essence. So that split has occurred, but then trying to go back and turn back the clock and trying to reunite the two of those, um, that's always been interesting because, in philosophy, we have this idea that if anyone is going to figure out ethics and figure out what's right or wrong and what you should do, what you ought to do, that's a job for a philosopher. Whereas a scientist takes almost a moral superiority in being amoral or being non-moral, to say, well, in order to keep my science pure, I must remove any moral considerations from this. So then trying to go back and reunite the two is especially important, whether we're talking about bioethics or AI, or race realism. Is we have to say, how do we, as we're engaging in empirical investigations of reality, how do we determine what kind of ethical framework we're going to use, which is more important than ever because we've lost this default, even, AD BC, right? That's a Christian concept. Now we use CE and BCE. So even that just really like a semantic distinction, or a distinction of an acronym that, ultimately what is the common era? It's defined by Christ, right? So you're not really getting around it. The French revolutionaries actually wanted to restart it from, year zero of the French Revolution. But, that sort of religious backdrop, as that has degraded and gone away, now there is this need or desire for ethicists, bioethicists, AI alignment, people to come in and say, what is going to regulate all of this empirical investigation? And so can you tell me a little bit, maybe, in terms of, you said with philosophy of science, the science is supposed to be interdisciplinary, but from the philosophy standpoint, do you concentrate in an area of, epistemics or deontology or something like that?
Well, there's a lot to say about what you just said. So, like, one of the things is I think that there's a lot of different opinions about like what philosophy is, right? I got into an argument with a guy on Substack who's like, all philosophy is terrible, right? We have the philosophers have to be fought against. I'm like, that's a philosophical position, and a lot of philosophers agree with you. Like Wittgenstein is like, all philosophy has been terrible, right? Basically. But this sort of like distinction between like the empirical stuff versus the kind of like loosey goosey philosophy stuff, like that's to my mind, that's more of like a recent way of thinking of things, right? Kind and like Locke is a really good example of this because like Locke and Newton like knew each other, and they were like seen as like kind of like the two leading figures of this kind of like new way of thinking in England, right? Um, and a lot of what Locke did in terms of his philosophy was seen as kind of like the epistemological framework for Newtonianism, right? So one of the big kind of ideas in Locke is this empiricism that is supposed to, focus in on what observations you have and not sort of constrain them by metaphysical hypotheses, right? And this was like super relevant to the Newtonian program because one of the big criticisms of Newton that people on the continent had was that like gravity is like you can't observe it, it acts at a distance, like this is an occult force, you're just an alchemist basically, which he was, right? But and so like scientists can't reason that way, right? Like we can say like from first principles that a force like gravity isn't good science, right? And Locke was like pushing back against that. He's saying like, no, 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 we don't need to have some sort of metaphysics to ground this predictive mathematics that we have, right? Newton doesn't have a hypothesis about what the cause of gravity is, and that's okay. That's fine. That's not magic, right? That's science is allowed to be that, right? And so you can't really separate out the nitty gritty of like scientific argument from deeper kind of philosophical questions. If you aren't explicitly addressing them, they're always kind of underneath there, right? You're just kind of taking them for granted, probably based on ideas that you absorbed, but which trace back to like Aristotle or to Locke or to some other philosopher, right? So the way that I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for all philosophers of science at all because there's a huge diversity of opinion, right? But kind of the tradition that I'm in very much sees science as embedded in a kind of a broader epistemological framework, right? That sets out, um, kind of the assumptions that you make about like what is science, what is observation, what does it mean to do empirical work as opposed to something else, right? And those things are not just like obvious, right? They might seem obvious, but actually there's different ways that you can answer the question, right? And what science is has changed a lot over time, right? So like again, like back in Newton's day, right? Newton and Leibniz and like Newton's buddy Clark are arguing about like which scientific theory is better, and a lot of the premises that they're using are like, well, your science leads to atheism, and that's a point against it, right? Like, obviously science is compatible with the truth of the Christian religion. So if your science is contrary to the truth of the Christian religion, it must be false science, right? It was just like obvious to them that that was perfectly reasonable to argue that way, right? And so, like, those frameworks change over time, right? And the way that we think about the frameworks that science is operating in is kind of inevitably going to be philosophical, right? And so the whole kind of like dichotomy between like, the hard stuff versus the soft stuff, and like the science versus philosophy, from the philosophy of science perspective, that's like a little oversimplified, I guess. Like a, a lot of philosophers of science just see philosophy as a very fundamental kind of um, necessary activity that underpins kind of all different areas, right? And so, yeah, I mean, of course, we keep getting sort of poked back by this need to like, oh, we need to consider some ethical questions here, right? Or like, actually, what is the status of like simulations and what they can tell us about reality or stuff like that, right? So I mean, these philosophical problems always kind of keep popping up, and sometimes people are very sort of dismissive about the role of philosophy and philosophers in it. And to be fair, you don't always need to be a philosopher to do good philosophy, right? Like there's lots of scientists who these kinds of questions, they have very good intuitive feeling for it, and they can rely on those intuitions to guide them in their epistemology, right? But I mean, it's still epistemology underneath, right?
Yeah. Um, I guess I feel that one of the transitions where we can go into this, not just having a historical conversation, but talking about the present day and the future, is maybe confronting. And because I come from a secular atheistic background, and so there was a period where I very much believed that that science is best when it is divorced from superstition. Religion is a form of superstition. Philosophy seems to contain all of these abstractions that aren't grounded in technology and the economy and real pragmatic things. I think I found when I started to engage with these ideas, effective altruism wasn't around. And now that it is around, I feel like I'm talking to my teenage self or something, which is not a degradation because I was a very smart teenager. But at the same time, I started to feel that as much as I was attempting to escape from superstition and dogma through atheism or libertarianism, that I started to feel like it was sneaking in the back door. That I found myself in a libertarian atheist cult of some sort. People are getting excommunicated, and all the same religious psychology was there. So I said, well, if we can't escape this thing, we need to start engaging with it and understanding it. That didn't give me a faith in any particular religion, but it made me feel that in the same way that there's a sexual impulse, and maybe if you just sort of liberate that sexual impulse, you might think that everything goes well. But as it turns out, you know, when we talk about, we say the sexual revolution, everything became permitted. Well, that's not entirely true, right? And that's why consent theory is so important today, because consent theory has basically replaced Christian morality as the dominant um, pull of sexual limitation. And you say, okay, well, what is, Pandora's box? What is acceptable in here? And then what is the chaos outside of it? For Christians, it was, you have a marriage, and anything outside of that is evil. And now that that's kind of gone away and marriage is devalued, it's consent. And consent, if you think about it, is a mini marriage. It's like a 5-second marriage. It's like, I say I do, you say you do, and then all of a sudden we're in a consensual relationship, which can start and stop at any time. But still, within that moment, like, the concept of the Christian marriage has been preserved in it, and Christians were kind of innovative in that sense of opposing arranged marriage culture and embracing the idea of a connection between the soul and the conception of the soulmate, and the two bodies become one, that maybe even the two souls become one, right? Courtly love, the idea you should follow your heart and you should be a romantic, right? So all the stuff about consent theory today, which a lot of the leading theorists there would say, well, Christianity is this patriarchal, marital rape is baked into the cake of Christianity, but actually Christianity is the foundation for modern consent theory. Neither side really wants to admit that, in my opinion. Maybe you can, we can disagree on those points, but my intention here is just to demonstrate the way in which we have a dominant morality, and so one of the pushbacks that I get when I've written a couple of articles in defense of critical theory, critiquing race realism, critiquing some of these conservative or far right ideas where it's just like, well, we have to smash the system and totally restart civilization and start from ground zero. And, my argument is sort of, I would be much less skeptical of you if you had something that you wanted to replace the current system with. But instead, it's sort of a game of Jenga where you're like, well, we have this one woke block in our Jenga tower, and if we just remove that one block, then everything will be great. And I'm like, well, actually, all the other blocks are stacked on top of that one block, and if you remove that, you can't even tell me what you think, or you're being a little overly optimistic here. At the same time, it seems to be schizophrenic in the sense that, on the one hand, society would be totally fine if we just removed our central, ethical principles that we currently have. It'd be totally fine. And then on the other hand, it's like, well, actually, civilizational collapse would be good because, this is a wicked system that deserves, if it's based on lies, it deserves to fail. So, you can kind of switch, and sometimes it'll be the same person. Oftentimes, you kind of engage with Nathan Kaufness, and I think he's much more on the side of, well, we just switch out the Jenga block and everything goes well. And then other people are more on the side of, just crash it all, burn it all. And they find themselves, despite seemingly having, opposite ends in mind, they find themselves kind of aligned on a number of issues. And I say to the people who want to crash everything, it's hard to have a conversation. The people who want to preserve society, I say, doesn't it sometimes make you worried that you're on the side of the people who want to crash civilization, right? But maybe you can kind of speak to that. I mean, and your thoughts on, okay, and maybe even talk about, if you want, your own personal religious opinions or experiences in terms of, when we critique a particular ethnic, or not ethnic, it could be ethnic in some senses, but we critique a particular ethical, religious backdrop or constraint. Again, bioethics, there are a lot of Christians who are concerned about abortion and fetuses. And so even AI, I think there's a kind of superstitious or a concept of, what does it mean to be human? Is AI going to destroy humanity? Is it going to enslave us, right? These are ethical concerns that come, I think, from deeply religious and mythological places, even like the Terminator, right? There's a kind of mythology about iRobot, Isaac Asimov. So all of these ideas, these ethical ideas, are derived from either ancient myth or modern myth. And they do present certain challenges to scientific exploration and research. How do you? I think I know a little bit of your opposition to Kaufness, but you know, do you have like a, I guess, and there's a line here between kind of prescribing and saying, this is bad for science and this is good for science, as if science is like, um, I don't know, like the sacred figure, the sacred object, rather than a tool. So yeah, I guess I'm struggling to formulate a pointed question and say, like, is wokeism good? One question could be like, is wokeism better or worse for science than Christianity was for science? But I don't know if that's the right question to be asking.
Well, I don't know. There's a lot of interesting questions that came up in there, right? So, first of all, so you talked a little bit about how, in this big conglomeration of ideas that includes these race realists, if they're calling themselves that, right? There are these kind of like opposing visions almost, right? So there's this very conservative vision, right, that um, is trying to reach back to a past that they see as being better, right? Where, morals and various other aspects of society have been, eaten away by the acid of liberalism or whatever and secularism, right? And then there are these kind of like accelerationists who are reaching forwards towards something new, right? And I mean, it's one of the things that was surprising to me, right, coming into Substack, where I had, I'd been active online, but I had never really run into like race realism 4chan types, right? Um, was this like um, just kind of like lack of historical sensibility, right? And so, I mean, that was sort of the main point that I was trying to make with the race realist piece, right? Which is that like we've seen kind of what it's like when you have a society that is organized around the importance of race, right? I mean, if if we have any compunctions about imperialism at all, right? Surely the worst type of imperialism was the one that was based on this like fundamental conviction that you know there's a whole lot of people who are just fundamentally inferior, and so their just interests don't count that much, right? If at all, right? At least whatever else you can say about the British Empire, at least they did have this ideology that they were trying to help lift people up to their level, right? And I mean, so the idea that there's this shared humanity that even if these poor benighted barbarians are so far behind our magnificent civilization, they at least have the potential to kind of come up to us, right? And so like the it just seems pretty clear to me that there's a lot of good historical reasons to think that if you pull out that particular Jenga block, right, that things are going to collapse in a pretty terrible way. Um, and by contrast, like people who are reaching towards the future, like as far as I can tell, like the idea of race realism is mostly just like the thing that motivates it, I think, is what motivates a lot of like angry commentators, right? It's this sense that they've been lied to, right? That the consensus that they're hearing from the academy and from media organizations and that kind of thing is like this lie, right? And so part of the lie is that like men and women are basically equal, and part of the lie is that uh, I don't know, whatever else. But part of the lie is that races don't matter, and that these differences aren't important, right? And I just don't even know what the vision of these people who are reaching towards something new is, right? I think it's hard to find alternatives to liberalism or to like sort of traditional ethics that are based in religion, or to like some kind of like blood and blood and soil like nationalism, right? Like those are all sort of tested, right? They have proven themselves to be like effective enough that you can run a society off them, even if you're likely to potentially cause genocide, or like you can at least you have a society that works as a society for at least a little while, right? But like I don't think that the inhabitants of Kekistan have any vision that clearly is leading in a direction where you can see something that might work, right? Like ultimately, like what I mean, part of the reason why I engaged with it at the level of like looking back to history, right? Is that that does give us some real information about like what believing this can do to your society, right? It's like really quite corrosive, right? Just one of the things that is funniest to me about Kaufness is this like this one study that somebody did, I forget the details, where they like asked people like, if you knew that someone was less intelligent, would that make you hate them? And people were like, no, not really. And they're like, oh, so racism won't be a problem. I'm like, come on, like if even if we believe that, it's like it's not applicable to like saying, oh, this entire group of people is congenitally just stupider, right? And then, right? So, but be that as it may, right? It's like socially there are these very bad consequences, and what is it that sort of like even if, which I don't, by the way, think that the evidence at all supports, like suppose that there was some good evidence that there were racial differences in intelligence, like what does that get you? Like what's this supposed to show? I mean, for Kaufness it's supposed to be that I guess like that's evidence against structural racism, and so that's why we can throw wokeness into the dustbin of history, because we can get rid of the theory of structural racism. I mean, it's relevant, I guess, but it doesn't prove that there isn't also structural racism, right? um, and other than that, it's like maybe we change like educational policies or something. I mean, it's like all of these whether it's race or whether it's gender, right? I mean, for me, it comes back to like, oh, what's his name? That like linguist who's written a lot of stuff about the blank slate. I'm terrible with names. This is one of my worst things as a teacher. I'm always reaching for
Are
it.
you talking about? You're not talking about Chomsky. I'm not familiar with
Not
him either.
Chomsky. No, no, I think it starts with a P. But anyways, the argument from him, which I'll feel like an idiot when I remember his name because he's very famous, is basically just like, if you have liberal values, then it doesn't matter if, like, on average, women and men have better or worse capacities. It's like the rights that we give them and the valuing of them as moral things doesn't depend on any of that stuff, right? It's like, as long, I mean, we give rights and we think it's morally important to treat like people who have very serious mental disabilities, right? They still count in our moral calculus, right? I mean, unless we're Nazis. So it's just like, it doesn't seem like anything that's the basis for any like substantial reevaluation of the situation of our society, right? It's really just like, ha ha ha, these guys are wrong about this one thing, right? And if again, if you make this very central as being like this is very important, we've seen where that road leads. Like we have a lot of evidence about that, you know.
Yeah, I
So
think
I didn't
it's
address the religion stuff, but I'll maybe
sure. I mean, I think I threw a lot of stuff at you, kind of unsure of. I hate to pigeonhole someone in an area, and I just want to kind of lay out the charcuterie platter, and let us choose what we may. But I think you brought up an interesting trichotomy of, there are basically three forms of government that work. There's liberalism, there's theocracy, and then there's blood and soil. And those are the three forms of government. In
well, I don't
parallel.
want to say that's exhaustive, but those are relevant ones that have been,
Right.
around.
The ones that have survived for some period of time. And we could quibble about, well, is communism a distinct thing from liberalism? One of the interesting things, if you actually read Trotsky, Trotsky talked about the Ubermensch. Trotsky talked about improving the physiology of the human being through selective breeding. Now, many people don't know that. Many people don't read Trotsky. Even Trotskyites kind of ignore that, or they say, oh, well, don't pay attention to that one thing he wrote. Pay attention to his other body of work and so on. And of course, Stalin was a Lysenkoist. He didn't believe in genetics, and so none of that ever was implemented. But when you look back to that period, Havelock Ellis or Margaret Sanger, Galton, some of these people late 19th century, early 20th century, Jack London, there were socialists, there were people on the left who believed that there were these biological distinctions between people, that you could improve the human race through scientific means, through material means. And that wasn't seen as a contradiction. Now, Nazism burst onto the scene and kind of broke that maybe tenuous link between those different ideas, but they weren't always as opposed as we think of today. And the point there is to say that, the defining quality, or the defining ethical quality of socialist movements was equality and equality of opportunity, equality of merit, on the basis that they believed the capitalist system was an evolution out of feudalism, but at the same time included these class distinctions where just because you're the son of a rich man, just because Donald Trump's father was rich means that he's going to be rich, and so on and so forth. And this creates a kind of liquidity trap where all of the resources of society are held up by this kind of cabal or tribe, not of any ethnic group, but of rich people as rich people. Like, they're hoarding all the wealth. It's not being distributed equitably, and really people like Marx were saying, we want a society that's more technological, more efficient. We want the factories to be run by the people who know how to run factories, not by some rich guy because his daddy was a rich guy, because that's what was happening. A lot of noblemen were converting their landed estates, selling them off, and then buying factories and getting rich. And Marx said, well, they didn't earn that money, they just inherited it. So this isn't meritocracy. And a lot of the eugenicists were thinking, oh, we're about breeding a better human race. And so, as much as we think today that you have to, or equality inherently contradicts eugenics, that wasn't necessarily the case when those ideas were actually popular and held by intelligent people. And a lot of those, Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood, and it's a successful institution. It still stands today. So, these weren't dummies. These weren't moral idiots. And they actually took equality seriously in a certain sense. Now, how do we interpret?
I think it's not at all an accident that eugenics became popular when it did, right? Like, it was logical given the sort of context, and logical given um, the kind of both the ideologies and kind of the science at the time, right? Um, the thing is that it's one of those things where it was hard to predict. I'm not saying that some people didn't, but it was hard to predict the way that it would actually look when you try to implement eugenics policies, right? It was one of those things where the actual process was what people are like, oh, this is perhaps not quite so lovely as it seemed in theory, right? Now that we're actually trying to persuade people to sterilize themselves and trying to decide what exactly we do with these congenital idiots, it's a little bit uglier than I thought, right?
Yeah, I made a post because there's a guy from Israel who I talked to who he really doesn't like, he calls them rightoids, and I still don't really know what that, because I'm like, okay, Winston Churchill was a rightoid, and he's like, no, Churchill. I'm like, I don't know. He said keep Britain white. He was, so I'm not sure what his definition is, but I talked to him because he has some kind of disaffection with the right. He's he's living in Israel, but he's neither a Zionist nor an anti-Zionist. So I'm like, okay, we can have a productive conversation here. And he didn't interview the same woman I did an interview with. Listen to the interview, and he was saying, well, people don't know this, but actually Nazism and eugenicism have nothing to do with each other, because Churchill was a eugenicist, and many people were eugenicists who weren't Nazis. So this is not, you can't put them all in the same camp. And my response to that was, absolutely, you can be Jewish and you can be eugenicist at the same time if you want to be. There's no necessary contradiction. But I said, the Holocaust could not have happened without eugenics. It was a necessary precondition. Because prior to that, if you, like Christian anti-Semitism, the point of it was to convert Jews to Christianity. And at worst, they expelled them. They pushed them somewhere else. They deported them. But the idea behind the Nuremberg laws, which that was the first anti-Semitic law in Germany. the idea was specifically the law was justified as we don't want Jewish blood to mix with German blood because it's going to worsen our population. They're going to diffuse, and it was almost like the concept of homeopathic medicine, right? You could have like 1 millionth Jewish ancestry, and it would just completely destroy the German population. They thought this was an inevitable process, and it wasn't based off a spiritual or mystical idea, but these anthropologists who went to Africa and they studied, children of mixed marriages, and they said, this interbreeding thing is wrong. Then they took that back to Germany and they applied it to the Jewish population, and so, my argument was that these ideas, they don't they're not maybe sufficient for the Holocaust, meaning, you could be a eugenicist and not, that wouldn't necessarily logically conclude you to go to the Holocaust. But the Nazis, they could not have even begun that series of steps from the Nuremberg laws to Dachau. They could not have that logical progression, could not have occurred in the same way. Now, could there have still been mass killings? Sure, there could have been in Ukraine. There were these partisans and there were mass killings of Jews. Were they motivated by eugenics, or were they motivated by traditional anti-Semitism mixed with communism? So I'm not saying that every pogrom throughout history was motivated by it, but the specific event in that historical context. And that's not to say that if you rerun the clock or do eugenics in some other country at a different time, that it's necessarily going to lead back to that. But it does mean that, and regarding that specific article that you brought up, the idea that we can poll people and ask them, if you were racist, would you be mean to black people? And they say, no, I wouldn't. And it's like, that's, you're not really, that's not how ideas unfold. When an idea grabs hold of a society, it doesn't just unfold in the way that the average person might predict. It has these deep consequences. And
That's why I think that it's so, irresponsible to be like pushing these ideas without at least kind of like addressing the historical context, like it's just to me it's so ignorant, right? Like I think one of the things too is like people, my experience is, really don't recognize how racist the world was like 100 years ago, right? 150. Like now we have this idea like, oh, it was the bad guys that were the racists, right? But I mean, no, not at all. Like Churchill was extremely racist. Lots of English were racist. Like during the Second World War, like Hitler was inspired by, among other things, American segregation, right? And like there was a lot of common belief, right, supported by you know by prestigious scientists, right, in the reality of race, in the importance of race, right, and we can see very clearly what that meant for people who are from the disfavored races, right? Like this was a absolutely toxic and poisonous thing, and not just when it led to genocide, right? Like it was toxic and poisonous in the States, it was toxic and poisonous in South Africa, it was toxic and poisonous in India, it was toxic and poisonous throughout the British Empire, it was toxic and poisonous in Japanese imperialism, right? Like everywhere, it's just like it's cancer, because when you have a group of favored people who consider themselves to be better than everybody else, then you have a recipe that leads very directly towards extremely inhumane practices, right? Which you don't have to be anywhere near genocide to be an extremely bad situation.
yeah, it reminds me, I've noticed that a lot of people have been weighing in on the issue of veganism and the value of animal life and how we treat animal life. And one of the things I was reading recently, the guy was saying that if in 100 years or something we live in a vegan society where the majority of people are vegans, and your grandchildren, people look back at you and they're like, well, what excuse did you have to not be, the same way people look back at things that happened in the past. They say, well, why'd you go along with the majority of culture? Aren't you a rational thinking being? Couldn't you figure it out that this is the direction things were going? And why couldn't you get with the program? And that's another question in terms of bioethics. Of we talk about we talk about having the ability to restrict human experimentation, the Dr. Mengele style. But do we afford not even equal consideration, but do we afford any consideration to animal testing, especially of primate cousins? Because, and they're relevant because, they have a similar physiology, similar genetics. So if we test drugs on them, they're more likely than, say, mice to have a similar response to those drugs. And yet, how much, the chimps who die painful deaths, how much consideration do we pay them? And not just in terms of medical experimentation, but also zoos. Zoos are something that I think a lot of conservationists see as beneficial because they bring in money, they bring in awareness, awareness of endangered species. Hey, look, here's this beautiful rhino. It looks cool. You should donate to this fund. And so it's a kind of advertising. And it reminds me actually of something that happened in 1930s Germany where, and this happened in other places too, but they kidnapped people from Africa and put them in zoo exhibits. And people would come by and they would look at them. Now, the people who came and looked, they weren't there they didn't come there hatefully wanting to exterminate those people. They didn't come, in horror or something, but it was this kind of curiosity. And there wasn't this sense of exigence or empathy to say, the person on the other side of that cage doesn't want to live in that cage, and they've been kidnapped from where they belong, and they deserve some freedom. And so, things like SeaWorld, and all those things which they're kind of crossing a boundary of popular science where it's not clear where the entertainment begins and the conservation ends and all. And look, I'm a conservationist, and so it's a difficult moral question. But I guess, again, to place it in like a human context, if there was a tribe in Africa that was being, a Rwandan genocide or something, and then, we kidnapped some children and then put them in a cage and then had a big sign and said, like, stop the genocide of this rare tribe of Africans. It's like, I guess there's a utilitarian argument that would raise media coverage, but it's like, is that really how you want to do things? And so the ability of people to walk by a tiger in a cage and point at it and tap on the glass, but to not have that thought, this is a creature that animals are capable of feeling depressed. Animals are capable of not just biological infertility, but ceasing to breed because they are unhappy. So they have a psychological life, whether or not they're conscious. They're capable of feeling that suffering, and it seems to be most pronounced in these caged environments. So there's the issue of factory farming, of zoos, that so the bioethics as it applies to animals. This is a problem actually that if you go to the Hindu religion, which is actually a multiplicity of different traditions, but there is an idea of veganism, there is an idea of the sacred cow, and through reincarnation we can have empathy for animals because we see we're not so different from them. So it's not necessarily a question of the barbaric past versus the progressive future. How do you kind of how do you see those sort of bioethics? I mean, what is the sort of framework that you use to examine those questions?
Cool. Yeah, no, very interesting and difficult question. I wrote a few Substack articles about ethical questions, and I argued on Bentham's Bulldogs like posts. I wrote a few things, but my own ethical views, I'm a moral subjectivist, right? And so that's kind of like, just to give a bit of context. So what that means is that I don't think that there's like some answer out there that you can find, right, as to what is right and wrong, right? I think that ethical systems are based on our subjectivity, right? And sort of the foundation of them is our sort of intuitive judgments of right and wrong, right? And so what we share as human beings mostly is, our self-interest and our intuitive uh, empathy for the sufferings of others, right? And I mean, especially our kin and our friends, but then also, we have most of us, an intuitive empathy for even strangers, right? And then also for animals. Um, and so my sort of approach to animal rights is that, like, first of all, really, I don't have a lot of faith in this kind of like moral progress type of thing, right? I think what there is that is progressive about ethics is that I do think that we develop different moral ideas that um, start to better accord with our sort of intuitions and desires in different ways, right? So I'm a big liberal, and I think that fundamental liberal principles. There's a reason why they've become so ubiquitous, right? Um, like my own research in philosophy of science is about evolution, right? And so cultural evolution is something I'm really interested in. And I think that um, looking at moral theories in an evolutionary framework makes a lot of sense, right? Very similar to how you can look at religious theories in an evolutionary framework, right? Um, and so the thing though about the evolution of um, moral systems, right, is that one of the things that tends, I think, to cause them to change over time is the pushback from the people who are disadvantaged by them, right? And that's why if there is a trend towards more sort of inclusive moral system, that's sort of what's pushing it, right? So maybe particular technological changes made a difference. So like the fact that, with Napoleonic warfare, you had to arm like your whole male population. And so they had a certain amount of power, and that allowed them to get their rights more respected politically and morally, right? And you get these kind of utilitarian ethics that are saying everybody has equal rights, or, universal rights from a more deontological framework, right? But what's driving it is that moral systems that don't include like sort of everybody that has some power are like less stable, right? Um, and one of the kind of scary possibilities you see at the beginning of the 20th century is that, well, what if you have a moral system like Nazism, or arguably like Imperial Japan, right, that draws the boundary like very firmly like around the edge of us, where us is a very effective political and military unit, right? And then just everyone else is kind of screwed, they're left outside, right? um, so fortunately that didn't stick, right? And I mean, both communism and more sort of like capitalist liberalism have this very universal ethic, right? um, but it is, in the original conception, it's an ethic that goes right to the boundaries of humanity and not any further, right? um, and sort of historically evolutionarily speaking, and I mean, this is just very hand wavy, right? I don't want to pretend that I'm giving you like the science of this, right? um but like there are factors that drove it in that direction, right? Historical factors that drove it in that direction, that societies that give everybody a feeling that they have a stake in the society, right? And everybody feeling that morally they count, and that the government has legitimacy that is connected to the legitimacy that it gives to everybody's sort of individual aspirations, whether that's a little bit more sort of liberal in its flavor, or if that's a little bit more egalitarian in its flavor, right? That makes these societies and the kind of moral underpinnings of them very stable, right? So I think that there's going to be a bit of a, well, I mean, I don't want to put too much emphasis on this, but like that doesn't really happen with animals, right? There's animals have no ability to make us pay attention, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why um, a lot of practices, which I think are quite contrary to our moral intuitions, right, have continued for so long, right? Um, I think that you know for for people who aren't psychopaths, or who aren't, just pretty indifferent to other people and things, right? If they actually go and they see animal testing, if they see how cows are kept in factory farms, if they, see and interact with like chimpanzees or gorillas, there'd be like, okay, these creatures ought to have some moral weight, right? Um, and that their suffering ought to be considered to be significant, and we ought not to mistreat them, right? Um, and so I think that the very slow progress from this very obvious fact. I mean, people have been talking about the sufferings of animals for centuries, right? The very slow progress towards actually changing this, right? Whereas, I mean, if anything, things have gotten much, much worse with the development of factory farming, right? Um, it's exactly because there isn't this kind of um, social pressure. There isn't this kind of like evolutionary mechanism that is actually making anybody pay attention to it, right? It really is just like activists trying to be like, hey, this is really bad. Um, so now, in terms of the actual like ethically, what are our obligations, right? I mean, I think that comes down to a few different questions, right? Which, as a moral relativist, I don't think have absolute answers, right? I think we can what what we can potentially do is we can kind of figure out, given that most of us care about the suffering of animals when we're sure that we're suffering, and especially if like we think that they feel pain like we do, that factory farming and experimentation on apes, say, at a minimum, and maybe whales and dolphins and stuff, right? Like this goes contrary to our own beliefs, and so we should stop doing that, even if it's kind of inconvenient and obvious, right? But like a lot of the questions around, well, how far do you draw the line beyond that, right? Like, do we count shrimp? Do we count fish? Do we count all these other things, right? That depends both on questions about our moral intuitions that I don't even know what they are, right? And then also about factual questions, right? So again, I'm not going to be able to tell you any names, right? But when I commented on one of Bentham's Bulldog's posts, someone else said, pointed me in the direction of this scientific article that was basically asking the question, can fish feel pain, right? And you can try and address that, right? Like, as long as you are to some degree a physicalist and you think that sensations have roots in the brain, you can look at both brain structures and the way that you can identify how fish that have different sort of brain damage that changes the reaction and that kind of thing. That paper basically made the case, and it was persuasive to me, but that's not very very meaningful, right? It was persuasive to me that probably fish don't feel pain, right? And so if that paper is right, then we don't have to worry too much about our practices with fish, right? Because it's not causing any more suffering than cutting down a tree, right? But if that paper is wrong, then our practices with fish matter a lot, right? So I don't have answers there, but I do think that a lot of it does come down to, for me, first of all, the practical difficulty of trying to implement these changes when there's no body with power at all that is advocating for them, right? And then also these kind of like factual questions about, well, like, what exactly is suffering out there, right? um, one of the things, I don't know if you looked at it, but one of the other papers that I put on Substack was a thing where I was arguing against this idea that like wild animals are like suffering hugely and causing like a whole lot of like utilitarian negative whatever utils, right? um I mean, for me it would just be such a incredibly painful thing to be true if it was true. Of course, it being painful doesn't matter that much to its being true, right? But I think that you can make a case, I tried to, that um, the wildlife that exists in our ecosystems is, you know, on balance positive, right? And I think that you can make some of those arguments for a lot of farming practices as well, right? This is why I'm not a vegan, right? I mean, I'm not defending factory farming, but there's a lot of cows who live in ranches, right? Like, I'm I'm not convinced that they'd be better off dead, right? So, anyways, I talked a bunch. I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, you we can kind of there's a radical road to antinatalism that's on our path off in the distance there. And you know I guess I'm not a hedonist. I'm not an ethical hedonist. I don't. So, for example, if we talk about lab grown meat, and the idea is, well, this meat has no brain attached to it, and therefore, it's much better to eat that meat rather than meat that had a brain attached to it. Because when you separate the brain from the meat, you cause pain. We don't want to cause pain. And this isn't really a thought experiment I've ever considered directly before, but we could take that and we could invert it. And we could say, what if we created lab grown brain stems and we stimulated those brain stems with electric shocks to create a pain response? Like this physicalist paper on fish pain would say, if we find that the brain stem reacts in this way, which you could measure with an MRI or something, then that is equivalent to pain. Then we know that pain is occurring and pain is bad and we want to minimize pain. So if some mad scientist in a lab hooked up a bunch of, machines and started pumping out these brain stems and then electrocuting them. And we could find that actually he was so rich. And so, this is some dark Peter Thiel experiment or something. And they actually were able to kind of quantify this and discover that, this one guy was able to create such dense brain stems in the same way that, like, we're creating these smaller and smaller computer chips. Like, he was able to create such cheap, small brain stems. He was able to create trillions of brain stems that could feel the highest quality of pain, like the most intense, excruciating pain, according to our physicalist definitions. And he's just underground in his lab doing this all day, running it like, some kind of Bitcoin mining operation, but instead it's like a pain mining operation. And he's doing this uninterrupted, whatever. It's a nuclear power plant, so he's infinite access to energy. And meanwhile, we're just above ground walking around doing whatever. And someone points this out and says, well, do you understand what's going on here? Obviously, that just kind of invalidates everything. Like, clearly, on net, the reality of human civilization is bad because he has contributed more pain into the system than pleasure into the system. And therefore, the fact that such a thing could exist, which is a hellish reality. I mean, and not just Christianity, but in the Hindu tradition, there's also forms of hell. There's forms of punishment, and so the fact that such a thing is conceivable does, I mean, that is it's kind of the inverse. Like, whereas on the one hand, you're saying, well, I look at a fish, it doesn't really look human. Does it feel pain? Does it not feel pain? I don't really know. My intuition doesn't cause me to feel strongly about this fish or about an insect or some other creature. We do feel strongly about mammals. And I think that my explanation for that is that visually, and maybe platonically or something, we have so the human face is something that I believe is genetically ingrained. And the entire human body is necessarily genetically ingrained. DNA has the ability, and I don't understand this ability, and some of it actually has to do with electrical signals. They've shown that you can take fetuses, and you can, at a very early stage, you can introduce electrical signals, not change the DNA directly, but introduce electrical signals, and you can create, I believe, in place of genitals, an extra pair of limbs. Which is quite talk about animal experimentation, or I think it was done on mice or something. But you can, the interaction between genetics and electrical fields and all these, I don't entirely understand it, but the conclusion is that somehow or another DNA is able to encode physical architecture, the architecture of the body, which is fascinating that you have the DNA, which is basically a one-dimensional string. It's a line of code that's, fed through and then it's read. And the fact that that's able to create three-dimensional bodies to me is incredible. So the fact that it's able to do that, I feel that the concept of ancestral memory, or the ability for us to recognize certain forms as preferential to others. And the one way I'd prove this is take a green cucumber and drop it in front of a house cat. And the house cat has a reaction to the green cucumber. Why? Because it looks like a snake. And so the even if it had never seen a snake before, was never taught, acculturated or anything, it's not a learned behavior. It's an instinctual behavior. And so I believe that animals have the capacity to store imagery within their mind. And as we've grown and we've evolved out of, smaller mammals into apes into humans, every time we get that software update, now we're at the human update, right? We're at, mammal 3.0 or something. And now, you see a human face and you empathize, or you have a strong emotional connection to it. We see faces in the clouds and all sorts of abstract. We're always looking for faces. We're trying to recognize that specific pattern. But also, I think we still, just because we've layered new software on top of the old software, doesn't mean that the old software went away. It's still tinkering around somewhere. So I think that's my explanation of why we have a greater degree of empathy for mammals. It's actually something genetically hardwired. Now, finding those genes and decoding DNA, that's way beyond me. I'm not a geneticist. That's my hypothesis. Whereas we don't really have that for fish, because that's so long ago and that's so abstract. And I don't even think fish are as visual in their mating patterns. I think they rely much more on, pheromones and other ways of identifying, which fish to mate with. And they also mate collectively and seasonally, and there's all sorts of other signals. Whereas as mammals, we mate individualistically, and so it's really important that you're mating with someone of the same species and not a rock or a tree or something like that, wasting your time. But
Yeah.
so that's important for us, whereas it's not important for fish, and so we don't have like the memory of a fish encoded within us, and so as a result, we don't have this moral intuition about fish. But I guess my point with the experiment about like artificially creating a brainstem just to induce pain in it, is that an evil act? I mean, I guess on some superstitious level, I would recommend that we not do that just in case. I don't know, that there's some kind of divine retribution. It doesn't seem like a good intention to do that. But I guess I think there is significance in symbolism and aesthetics, and I think it has functional implications for us as a society. Now, you talked about kind of the evolutionary foundations of morality. If morality is good, let's just take an identical environment over a long period of time and plop two human groups down in the same environment over a long period of time, completely different moral codes. The society which is more successful, prosperous, populous, whatever, we could then say, well, that's a more evolutionarily adaptive moral code for that environment. Problem is, we have this feedback loop now between our morality and the environment, where the morality changes the environment, and then we're in a new environment, so we need a new morality to adapt to it, and it just keeps changing. We never get any stability with our morality. This is the feedback loop we're trapped in, and it causes a lot of psychological stress. But ultimately, eventually, we could conceive that, in a simulation, if we could perfectly simulate, which I guess, you could argue that's what reality is, but if we could perfectly simulate, okay, I'm going to create this biological organism called a human, I'm going to put it in this environment called the universe broadly, and then I'm going to give it some different moral codes, and I'm going to run the simulation and see which moral code results in the most number of humans with the greatest technology, and so on and so forth. There is, theoretically speaking, for any given environment, a best moral code from an evolutionary perspective. And I would, okay, you interject because you're,
Well, I mean, I don't know about that. Like one of the things about evolution, right, is that it's very, very environment specific, right? Something that is suitable for one environment is not going to work in another environment, right? And so when we try to like abstract away and be like, okay, across the entire universe in all possible situations, like what is the one moral code? Like, to me, that's kind of a meaningless question, right? Like, I don't think it's well enough specified. Um, and like with when I'm saying that, like, there's this kind of way of looking at morality evolutionarily, right? Um, I think that what a lot of philosophers, right, tend to get caught up in, and not for no reason, right, is the purely sort of abstract question of like, okay, if we're considering in the best possible world, like what is the code that we ought to follow, right? They do lose sight of the fact that morality is a real world phenomenon, right? It is a code that is instantiated in societies, right? And it governs how people actually act. And in a certain sort of weird way, right? A morality can be very successful despite being what probably you or I or most philosophers would be considered to be immoral, right? Um, so, like, you know, various sorts of aggressive imperialisms, right, can be pretty successful, right? And uh, you can have a system where you've got like an oppressor class and oppressed class, and that boot can keep stomping on that face for a pretty long time, maybe indefinitely, right? Um, so I don't have any particular opinion about. I certainly don't have any faith that like what you're going to get as the social system that is the most sort of like durable and sort of like promotes the most humans in the long run or anything like that is going to look anything like moral to what I would consider to be moral, right? um, what I think is that as as a moral relativist, right, um, I'm committed to my morality, right, and my morality is based on what I care about, right, and this is ultimately there can be some like reasoning that we do to kind of like argue about what should matter and what shouldn't matter, but it always comes back to other values that we hopefully share, right? There's this idea of the is ought distinction that goes back way in ethics, right? And I do think that when you're arguing about oughts, you always come back to other oughts, right? Um, and so like when you're talking about questions like, okay, how should we evaluate this scenario where there's this like guy underground who's been torturing millions of brain stems, right? Like, again, I don't think that there's an objective answer to that question, right? I think that subjectively, if I'm convinced that these are living things that are feeling pain, then I think that he's done something really, really horrible, right? I mean, I don't know what lesson we can take from that because I don't think that, I'm guilty for his sins, right? Or that society is. But you definitely would want to say, like, yeah, it would have been a lot better if that guy had, gotten run over by a trolley on his way to work at some point. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so this I would agree with you that there are different steady states of morality. So for example, with AI or nanobots, we can conceive of a gray goo that is like this perfect silicon based organism that it just goes around and it's much more efficient than biological life at obtaining resources from heat and sunlight and everything, and it just consumes everything and it turns the entire universe into paper clips or something. And at least theoretically speaking, I don't know if that's actually true. I don't know if such a thing is possible. I think was it Nick Bostrom is kind of the popularizer of that idea as a potential apocalypse. But yeah, I don't know if that is true. But I certainly, looking back at human history, as you've said, you can have an extremely tyrannical, oppressive, primitive, superstitious society with a caste system where you just have people at the top and people at the bottom, and they're just constantly boot on the face. I would also say, however, that even the most oppressive societies, I think inevitably have some kind of social mobility, even strictly slave based societies. Because, in the same way that I would argue that those nanobots eventually there's going to be a glitch in the code, something's going to go wrong, any sufficiently complicated system, biological or mechanical, is going to break down and mutate and speciate and compete with itself. And there's going to be some kind of differentiation that arises. Sparta ultimately, at the end of its, city state slash empire, um, there was a caste of people who were descended mixed marriages between Helots and Spartans who started to become kings. And so that's, to me, no matter how strict and authoritarian your social system is, eventually it will break down and there will be some kind of meritocracy or social mobility that arises from that. Now, let's say on the opposite end, right? You create a perfect meritocracy, perfect equality. It's just heaven on earth, and everyone is exactly where they should be. If you're born to be a doctor, this society makes sure you're a doctor. If you're born to be a plumber, whatever you love, whatever your passions are, whatever you're attracted to, this society ensures that the best possible state is achieved. Well, of course, something bad's going to happen. Something's going to get corrupted. And then there's almost this mean or middle that the most evil societies and the most good societies tend to regress to this mean. Because if you try perfectly to be evil, you're gonna mess up. You're gonna trip up, and you're gonna accidentally do something good every once in a while. So yeah, I think that there is this possibility that in terms of the human lifespan, we could conceive of a dark age where for hundreds of years, or this is the fear of like a nuclear apocalypse, is that you wipe out civilization and who knows how long it takes us to rebuild things, if ever, or let's say we wipe out all life on Earth. Is it going to develop somewhere else? So there is this concept of like a well that you've fallen into, a steady state. In population dynamics, if you absolutely wipe out, or if you reduce the human population to just a few individuals, those people might breed, but then their children are going to have so many mutations. Eventually, you're going to become infertile in the human race. So there's a minimum population that you need. And you could say with social systems or moral systems even, you can get stuck in these really nasty steady states for a long time. And we can look at the history of a lot of ancient civilizations and say, wow, they were just doing human sacrifice for hundreds of years, and no one ever came along and said, maybe we should reform the system. Like, let's try something different. Like, I have a different idea. They just kept going along. So, in fact, moral systems, when they take power, tend to be extremely conservative. They want to maintain their power. And if they're able to do that, they will. But there's no ability to see outside of that. I think that's kind of what George Orwell 1984 sort of is predicting, is the idea that we could achieve a level of authoritarianism and perfect state control over media that people wouldn't even know what they're missing. They wouldn't even be able to go back and look in history. And I think actually this is part of the reason we had the Renaissance, is because medieval authors coming out of the Dark Ages started to look at the old Greek and Roman authors, and they thought, wow, this is pretty cool. These guys were smarter than we were. They had all these amazing things. Maybe we should learn from that. Maybe we should change up some of the things we're doing and be open to new ideas. And, that unfolded. It took a long time, but eventually, is actually, I think people think that it was like the 16th century when Europe surpassed the ancient world. But actually, it's closer to the 12th century. There's a lot of evidence that we were fully out of the Dark Ages by that point. But anyway, that's besides the point. I'm kind of distinguishing, I guess, between you can have a moral system which is self-sustaining, but that's different from having a moral system which is the most expansive and the most, interplanetary colonization and those sorts of things. Like, in some sense, like, we have yeast, we have crocodiles, we have species on Earth that are remarkably conservative. They basically are the same exact species they were millions or even billions of years ago, and they haven't changed much. And we as humans, I guess I'm not suggesting or saying, I think it's something different to say there's a perfect moral system for all living things, because there's so many different ways to live. There's single-celled organisms, multicellular organisms, individualistic, collectivistic, herd, hive, all these different forms of life. But if we accept that there's such a thing as human nature, that we have a human bodily form, there is, within the environment of humanity, not the environment of the planet Earth and the rocks and the soil and stuff, but within the environment of our own bodies, taking our bodies as an environment in itself, then there is, it's easier to say, or easier to conceive of the idea that there is like a perfect moral code with respect to human nature. Now, genetic engineering, if you can start altering what it means to be human, then morality comes under threat once again, and it's difficult to get to a steady state.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a few things there. Like, I agree with you that, insofar as human nature is kind of like a given and there's a lot of similarity between humans, there is at least, I think, the possibility that there's something like a best moral system, right? So in one of the articles that I wrote about ethics on Substack, I say that. And I mean, a kind of a caveat, right, is that I do think that human nature is fairly disparate, right? And that there's a lot of possibility for socialization and that kind of thing to shape the way that people think about other things, right? So, like, again, like one of the big dichotomies for me, right, is this like what's the sort of size of your moral circle, right? Is it everybody? Is it less than everybody, right? I think that human nature is very congenial to having it be less than everybody, right? It's not that hard for us to be taught that these other people don't count, right? And I think that a ethical system like that can be very durable, right? It's one that I find appalling, but it's one that I think is not that hard to get people to buy into, right? It's much harder to get people to buy into like a totally self-sacrificing ethic or something like that, right? Where you don't, put yourself at least a little bit first. Um, so the other thing that I think makes thinking about ethics and how ethics can match social systems hard, right? Is that for us a huge part of the environment is our technological substrate, right? And that is changing really, really, really fast. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of the definitely a lot of the practical factors that have determined what actual ethical systems have spread versus what actual ethical systems have declined is based on technology, right? I mean, the story isn't too far off from the Marxist one, right? I mean, you can correct it somewhat, right? But I mean, the Industrial Revolution really was a big deal, right? And um, the move to the digital age is potentially going to upset our social relations similarly. I mean, I don't know exactly if it is, but it seems likely from where I'm standing, right? Um, I think that, there's at least a case to be made that, you know, broad liberalism, right? And here I'm including the kinds of socialism that aren't like very authoritarian, right? Um, Broad liberalism, I think you can make the case that it's a very good fit for human nature, right? um, because the basic idea is like giving people the maximum freedom that is compatible with like you know other people not suffering, right? um, and something like that um, seems like it has a lot of reasons why you expect it to be stable, and it fits pretty well with our preferences, and that kind of thing, right? And then you can argue about the details and how much we care about like egalitarian and so forth, right? But the thing that I think is kind of interesting and maybe a little bit alarming um, is that, I mean, there is this view which I already alluded to, right, that says that like historically liberalism becomes prevalent because of the need of states to make use of like their entire male body in fighting in wars, basically, right? And one of the directions that we can certainly see um, the digital era going, right, is that, I mean, human males are going to be totally useless for fighting wars, right? We're not going to need them at all, right? And we're also not going to need people generally to make anything, right? So there's no real necessary connection between people and the power base of the society, right? Whoever controls the robots controls the future, right? Um, and so although I think it's a very bad fit for our interest broadly, right? I certainly can see the argument that says that, the robot future is one that fits very well with fascism, right? Or fits very well with autocracy, right? Because people do like to collect power, right? And capitalism has this kind of winner takes all structure to it. And building robots has this kind of winner take all structure to it, right? And so it does seem pretty plausible that you just end up with a whole lot of power in very few hands and no mechanism to force people to redirect it, right? And I don't have a lot of faith in relying on the benevolence um, of people with absolute power to look after the interests of everybody else, right? So that's kind of the worry that I have, right? Even if there's a sense in which the ethics that underpins sort of our nature sort of suggests a certain type of social arrangement, right? The actual development of power, the actual development of the technological environment might lead things in a different direction.
Regarding capitalism, you have an article that's entitled "Only Government." Well, there's a question mark at the end, so only government can save the market from the capitalists? Question mark. Um, can you maybe as our final topic here tonight? Can you talk a little bit about this contradiction? Do capitalists hate capitalism? What's going on there? How do we resolve this paradox?
Yeah. Well, have you read Peter Thiel's article about monopolies? That's sort of the starting point, right?
Um, I haven't read that article. Um, I think he doesn't like monopolies.
No, he
Uh,
thinks they're amazing.
he
Right.
thinks they're
It's
amazing.
it's it's
Okay,
it's
never
it's
mind.
it's a it's a
That's
really
a
it's a
revelation.
really it's a really interesting article, and that was kind of what. So I'll just give you the short version. Okay, so first, what Thiel says, right? Thiel says monopolies have a bad rap, right? But actually, monopolies are good and necessary and important, right? And he has a few reasons for saying that. But first of all, he says, okay, suppose that you are some entrepreneur and you would like to start a business. Okay, um, one of the things that you should definitely do if you're trying to start a business is you should try to avoid any place, sort of paraphrasing what he says, any place where there's a perfect market, right? Because one of the things about perfect market is that there's perfect competition, and in perfect competition, there's zero profits, right? So if you're wanting to start up a business, don't go where the market is perfect, right? Um, and like that's why starting a restaurant is often a bad idea, right? Because there's really often very little to differentiate you from all the other restaurants, right? um, what you need to generate profits, he doesn't put it this way, but what you need to generate profits is you need a market failure, right? You need imperfect competition, right? And he focuses on the fact that if you are innovative enough, you create a market failure, right? And if you're innovative enough, that market failure is actually not a net detriment, it's a net benefit, right? Because essentially, like, so he got rich from PayPal, right? When you create PayPal, what you've created is a new way of paying for things on the internet, which is a really useful service, right? That didn't exist before. And all of a sudden, you have made the whole economy function a bit better, right? Right. So a lot of people have benefited, but no one can compete with you yet because it's a brand new thing, right? And so you make a lot of profit. And so that's what Peter Thiel thinks capitalists should be doing, right? Basically, you innovate to create a new product that no one can compete with you, right? Because it's brand new. It creates something entirely. And if you also, another way of getting a monopoly through innovation is you just innovate in your production technique, right? And all of a sudden you are making cars way cheaper, like your Henry Ford. No one else can compete with you, right? And as much as, yeah, Henry Ford gets really fucking rich, he gets really fucking rich by making cars cheap for everybody so ordinary people can afford them, right? The whole society benefits, right? So Thiel's point is that monopolies are often, or innovative monopolies are actually win-win, right? Because what gives the monopoly its edge is the fact that it is providing this valuable thing that nobody else can do, right? So the funny thing, though, right, is when early on in the paper, when he's talking about monopolies, he says, I forget the exact phrasing, but he's like, there's sort of three ways you can have a monopoly. You can be innovative, you can like have government favoritism on your side, or you can use illegal bullying, right? So those are three ways that you can create a monopoly. And he says, like, basically, he's not interested in the other two, right? But the other two are real, right? You can create and defend a monopoly by by actively like attacking your opponents, which is what the Dutch East India Company did and the British East India Company did, right? Um, you can do it by bribing the politicians, or by creating a super PAC to get the politician who is friends with you elected or whatever, right? So there's lots of antisocial ways of creating monopolies, right? Um, and so the point that I was making is that, like, Thiel is quite right that the objective of an entrepreneur, right, is never to create a better market. It's to create a worse market for them, right? A worse market in a way that's beneficial to them, right? Your job as a CEO is to try to make sure that your company never faces perfect competition, right? Um, and any way you can do that is beneficial, right? And so, yeah, there are beneficial forms of monopoly, and I mean that's, for example, why we give people patents, and that's why there's copyright, because we want to incentivize people via monopolies and the profits that come with monopolies to doing these creative endeavors, right? But I mean, you can see it with the tech companies, right? They get started with something innovative that's actually really good, right? But then they use their monopoly power to shitify their stuff, right, and increase their profits even further. And they use the power that that initial monopoly gave to defend themselves against competition, right? And not necessarily by using even illegal bullying. There's lots of legal ways of bullying your way into this, right? And so the basic point that I was making is that there's this fundamental opposition between a good functioning market and the incentives of the capitalist class, right? The capitalists always want to destroy a proper functioning market for the benefit of their company specifically, right? And there's lots of ways that they can use their power to do that. And Thiel basically ignores that, right? Like, he's sort of like, well, even if you've got a shitty monopoly, you can break that just by innovating better, right? Like, you can come up with, eventually someone will come up with a better Google or a better Facebook, right? After they've got all bloated, and then, outcompete them and they'll go to business, right? I mean, maybe. But I mean, in the meantime, there's a lot of shitty anti-competitive stuff that they're doing, trying to destroy the market, right? And that's bad for the market, it's bad for society, it's bad from the point of view of anybody who thinks that markets have an important role, right? And so the kind of take home message of the story is that, like, we sometimes think of capitalists as being like allies of the markets, but no, they're the enemies, right? And it's actually government's responsibility, I think, to try and keep the markets functioning, right? Because the natural tendency of markets in the real world is to is at least the natural tendency of the capitalist is to try to destroy the market.
My first reaction to this is that we have to abolish copyright law and patents. I think of Tolkien writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and now you could ask yourself, if there was no such thing as literary copyright, would he have still written those books? Maybe, maybe not. Um, but you know, he's dead now, and somebody has inherited that copyright. I can't make a Lord of the Rings movie. I can't sell Lord of the Rings toys. I can't rewrite. I can't write a book called Lord of the Rings Part 7, the future of Middle Earth or something. I will get sued by some company. I don't know if it's Disney. I don't know if it's Viacom. I don't know which company owns the copyright, but somebody does. And the idea that somehow there is the argument you could make would be that when Tolkien was writing the Hobbit back in the 20s or 30s, whenever he started writing that he wouldn't have put in as much effort. He wouldn't have dedicated as much time if he said, well, someday my grandchildren will sell this to Viacom and they'll get really rich. Like, the incentive structure of capitalism, or the idea that you should make good art, or you should make good technology, or you should tinker around, or you should experiment, you should do research, because you're not, it's not just you who's going to get unfathomably rich, or even your descendants, but that someday your products can be sold off to a multinational company and they can get really rich off of it. No,
That's what everyone dreams of, I think, when you
right.
create art.
Yeah.
That's what you're imagining in the future.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, no,
go ahead.
yeah. Well, I mean, look, I agree, and the so copyrights and trademarks and that kind of thing, right? I mean, clearly there's a reason why we have them, and arguably maybe 100 years ago, right? They were a net positive, maybe, right? But I think that it's pretty clear, right, that given the coming of the digital revolution, right, given the centrality of media in our modern economy, right, that copyright and trademark are preventing a huge amount of valuable stuff, right? Like, just from a big picture thing, right? It's crazy that people around the world have to pay these huge rents to Disney and Paramount and Netflix and all this thing. Like, we can very easily deliver all this stuff for free, right? We or not for free, but for very, very cheap, right? The fact that copyright is being used in this like vampiric ghoulish way, right, is very, very like counterproductive. And I really do think that it's a case of uh, the something that was maybe defensible in the industrial era, right, is just incredibly counterproductive and maladaptive for the digital era, right? But we're stuck with 100-year-old laws, and oh, I'm gonna fucking forget this too. But the book is Four Futures, and there was also an article based on it. It's like Frank or something is the guy's name, right? But he talks about like different ways that the automation could go, right? And one of the things that I think he's very accurate in deriving is just that like copyright and trademarks and control over information, if we keep it as private, if we keep it as monopolies, if that's the mechanism that we use to reward creators, it's just like it's disastrous. It leads to this concentration of power in very, very few hands, right? You see Cory Doctorow arguing very similar stuff, right? Like, the pro-human future is the kind of like it's the freeware future. It's the future where we figure out some other way to reward and incentivize creation, right? That doesn't rely on this like really careful control and selling it individually to people, because it's not a friggin' commodity. It's not a good. It's not a physical thing, right? Trying to regulate it that way is insane. Um, and so, some solution is going to have to be figured out. And I don't think it's going to be, it's going to involve a lot of government intervention to be a good one, right? I like the idea of having, payments go to some sort of government remunerative fund, and then it pays back out to creators, right? Like, that way you don't have to control the output, you just reward the use of it. But anyway, yeah.
So I'm cool with the use of government for all kinds of things. I think definitely, um, you know, the government has the government can be used to see that, hey, there's a project where there's currently not any business that will immediately benefit from this. In fact, some businesses probably won't be happy about this project, but once we have the project completed, then new businesses can form. I mean, the internet, the roads, canals, all sorts of other things. So I think there's an argument that, taxation is good and government spending can be good. It's not always good, but it can be good, because it can explore areas that capitalism might not have those short-term incentives to work. There's just too much initial cost, and the benefits are too dispersed throughout the population. So I'm sympathetic to those arguments. In this specific case, I can hear the libertarian, the ghost of libertarianism crying out and being like, copyright law is a government intervention. And so we don't actually need the government to come in and protect us from corporations. We need to get the government out of copyright law. And I'll give an example. Historically, you said, maybe 100 years ago, this was a good idea. Well, Charles Dickens was one of the most famous novelists of the 19th century, and he was constantly complaining about the fact that everyone in America was reprinting his books and not giving him a single penny. But he was also the most prolific author, one of the most prolific. I mean, he just wrote so many books, and he was also writing for newspapers. He wrote things outside of his novels, but he didn't say, well, because someone somewhere is stealing my work, therefore I'm going to stop. So artists don't become less productive. They might complain about it, but the idea that somehow, and he was a wealthy man, he made a lot of money off of his stuff. He did speaking appearances, he did tours. Every newspaper wanted to serialize and print his stuff. And so obviously he's going to give it to one newspaper first, and people are going to buy that newspaper. And if some other newspaper copies it, they're going to be like, well, I already read that in another newspaper, so it's old news now. So you don't need government intervention to reward creators for their creations. And creators don't need, billions of dollars. Most of them do it because they love it. Now, they might also want to have billions of dollars, but eventually the sickly gerontocratic economy that creates down the line, if you just say, oh yeah, copyright's infinite, it's going to be 150-year copyright, never expire, you can just keep renewing it. Well, the effect now is that I really want to remake the Star Wars trilogy, and I can't do that. George Lucas is a very rich man, and I'm glad he's made some money off of his stories, but we really need a proper remake, and right now Disney's stopping me from doing that. So I'd really appreciate if the government just stepped out of the way and let me do what I want to do. But yeah, I mean, we could that topic of government intervention versus libertarianism. I was very surprised to hear. I've listened to a couple of things Peter Thiel has said more on cultural issues rather than economics, and so I was surprised to learn that his argument about that. And it's definitely interesting. I would say that there's been some studies done that I want to dig into this into the future, but the idea that the most inventive and creative period of Western civilization was the Industrial Revolution, I'm becoming increasingly skeptical of that. And how exactly we measure inventiveness and creativity is really difficult because it's a qualitative question. But I think there is some evidence that the Industrial Revolution, rather than being the height, is actually kind of the aftershock of a revolution that occurred between the 12th and 15th centuries. So, if that is the case, they definitely didn't have copyright law back then. And in fact, all of those inventions were coming not out of the dominant monopolistic economic structure, which was the guild system. It was coming from these crazy alchemists and Freemasons and Tycho Brahe and Galileo, all these crazy people where they would have an individual patron and they would kind of step outside the existing system and do something completely new. That's where all the best stuff came from. So, I almost feel that copyright law is something that came quite late in the game and tried to take credit for all the inventions. Oh, well, if we didn't have copyright law, no one would ever invent anything. And it's like, historically, it's clearly not true. There are many people who they love being creative and they love inventing because they love the process, and it's an erotic exploration of the unknown and the future, and it's romantic. And I think actually commercializing that via government force and making it into people would only invent things, like, especially in terms of art. I think if you say, well, why does art suck so much? It's like, well, it's because, there's a lot of graft and there's a lot of tax fraud around art of you can buy a painting and value it at such and such and sell it at such, there's a lot of this like financial manipulation in terms of when people say, oh, no one makes good art anymore. That's not true. It's just you went into an art gallery, a museum that's sponsored by all this wealth, and that's what you think art is. But you're just basically falling for some propaganda that some rich person or group of people, board of directors or local city council decided these artists get the funding and the other artists don't. Well, that says nothing about what artist is or what art is being produced. Great. I mean, I send people music all the time and they say, how'd you find this? This guy only has 80 subscribers. How'd you find this music? And it's like, it's difficult, but it is out there. People are making beautiful things. People are inventing crazy things. And thankfully, with inventions, because there is ultimately a profit motive for discovering those things and implementing them, they're a bit easier to find than the art, where, we have these dominant, we have this monopolistic, art is actually, I would say, even more subject to monopolistic pressure, and culture is more subject to monopolistic pressure. And they say, oh, why does everybody hate each other in this culture war? Why is our culture so polarized? It's like, well, yeah, if you watch Fox News all day, you watch CNN, that's what. But turn off the TV, unplug it, and get on Substack and subscribe to our Substacks and read what we have to say, and you're going to get a totally different slice of life. So don't get too caught up in what's going on in the Leviathan. There's still beauty in the world. There's still good stuff. So I think that's my message of hope and positivity at the end of this. I do want to give you the last word and final thoughts and anything you want to share with the audience.
Sure. Well, copyrights and that kind of thing is an attempt to solve a market failure, right? With this particular government intervention. And I mean, first of all, we produce lots of things through non-market mechanisms, right? Like a lot of people, yeah, they create art because they love it, or they invent, right? Not because they're really hoping to make money off it, right? I mean, that said, the market is like it's an engine for getting people to make stuff, right? But we can solve that particular market failure in other ways than copyright. Like there's lots of other alternatives, and I just feel like copyright and the the idea that how we create art is we have to turn it into this commodity and sell it in units. It's just like it's outmoded, right? It is held in place by particular special interests who profit off of it, but it's not at all the best way of doing it, right? And yeah, no, I think like Substack is kind of nice in that it does have this aspect of like you are making money of it off it potentially. I mean, that's not how I'm using it, but um, you it's a different model where it doesn't require copyright, but it still is channeling money to the creators, right? That's another way of getting the market to produce it, right? Like there's lots of alternatives that are a lot more suitable, I think, to the digital age than saying, yes, you cannot copy it unless you have this permission and this, and government is going to enforce it, right? I mean, it is this huge government like boot that is stomping down on you, and all you want to do is remake Star Wars, man. But yeah, no. So I guess the only other thing that I'd say is, yeah, I have a Substack and it's free. And if you're interested in this stuff, you can check out my articles about it, I guess. And I'm going to try and keep writing for fun, right? Not because a market mechanism is forcing me to. Oh, I can't hear you. I I can't.
Oh, whoopsies. I was
Yeah,
just
there
going
you
to
go.
ask, as an addendum, anything on your bookshelf, anyone you're reading on Substack that you'd like to shout out?
Oh boy. um, Let me just see. On Substack, I mean, I have to say it has been really interesting coming onto Substack. I haven't been on super long, and there's a lot of really cool stuff. But I mean, I like CryptoGal, I like Razib um, obviously I like Astral Codex 10, and Bentham's Bulldog is pretty fun, even even if I disagree with like almost everything that he writes. Um, and yeah, there's a fair amount of like interesting moral philosophy stuff going on, and I'm just kind of starting to get into some of that. And so I mean, if you follow my Substack, then you get all of my shares and recommendations and stuff, so you can see what I'm into, I guess.
All right, people are going to have to go subscribe. I really appreciate you coming on today. I think this was great. We covered a lot of ground, and as you're publishing more stuff in the future, I'm sure we'll have more to talk about. But for now, we'll end it there. Appreciate you coming on, and hope we can talk again soon.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Absolutely. All right, take care now. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
All right, guys. It's almost a 2 hour one. We did a big one. That was a big one. That was a big one, everybody. Eugene, we had Eugene on. So if you liked it, Give it a like. If you have something to say, please comment. And if you want to restack it, that I think restacking is like the most powerful thing you can do. I think a like is kind of, it's good. It's not bad. I'm never going to say don't like it, but a like is good. A comment is good. It might even be better than a like, because a like is like, if I have a post and it has one like on it, then I'll be like, this is okay. But if I have a comment and it's super sweet, super nice, then I feel really good. But if somebody restacks it, I think just algorithmically, I think that means that I think that's how we maximize visibility. If you're a true fan, then you're going to restack literally every single post they do. Actually, don't do that. That might be interpreted as spam. They might think you're a robot. They might think you're a paid Chinese robot if you restack literally every single thing I've ever done. But if you restack things as they come up, as you feel like it, 1 out of every 10 articles or something, I'm sure it's much appreciated. I really I appreciate the support. I support your support. And if you want to support me even more, of course, there's I sign up as a paid subscriber. But guys, I'm not doing this. I'm not creating this because this is the most amount of money I could be making. I could work a normal job just like everybody else and make a lot more money. But I love creating, and I love having conversations with people. It's incredibly rewarding in itself. So if you got some benefit out of it, I'm very happy to hear that. Let me know. And until then, sayonara. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.